Mercedes could be on the verge of losing everything, and this time, it's not just rumors. The FIA has launched a deeper investigation, after new evidence exposed what might really be happening inside that engine. Because what looked like a genius loophole could actually be a system designed to bypass the rules exactly where no one was checking. And here's the number that changes everything. 16-1 is the legal limit, but under real race conditions, Mercedes may be running closer to 18-1. That's up to 40 extra horsepower. That's not an advantage. That's domination. 3 races, 3 wins, and a gap that no one can explain. But now, the FIA is no longer just observing. They are digging deeper than ever before. Because if this is confirmed, Mercedes didn't just find an edge. They may have built an engine that breaks the limit when it matters most. So the real question is no longer how they're winning. It's this: are those wins about to be questioned? Or is Mercedes already too far ahead for anyone to stop them? Stay with me, because what was just uncovered after Japan might be the biggest technical scandal Formula One has seen in years. Subscribe now, because this could decide the entire 2026 championship. Right after the FIA confirmed the new investigation, something changed inside the paddock. Because this was no longer a theory. It became a risk, a real one. And for the first time this season, teams stopped talking about how to catch Mercedes, and started talking about what happens if they're found guilty. Because here's what makes the situation different. This is not a standard technical protest. This is not about a wing, not about a floor, not something you can remove between sessions. This is the engine, the heart of the car, the one component that defines everything else. And if there's a problem there, it doesn't just affect performance. It affects every single lap they've already completed, every overtake, every strategy call, every win. And that's why the FIA is being extremely careful. Because they are not just investigating a part. They are investigating consequences. And those consequences could reach much further than anyone expected. But inside the data, there's one detail that triggered all of this: consistency. Because after Japan, engineers started comparing not just peak performance, but repeatability. And what they found was unsettling. Mercedes wasn't just fast. They were predictably fast. Every lap looked the same. Every acceleration phase, identical. Every energy deployment, perfectly timed. No fluctuation. No drop-off. And that's not normal. Because even the best cars in Formula One show variation. Small losses. Tiny inconsistencies. It's part of the sport. But Mercedes looked immune to it. And that's what raised the next question. What if the engine is not just exceeding the limit, but doing it in a controlled, repeatable way? Because if that's true, then this is no longer a side effect of heat. It's design. Intentional. Precise. Engineered to behave exactly the same every time it reaches race conditions. And that's a completely different level of problem. Because now, the FIA is not just looking at numbers. They are looking at patterns. And patterns are much harder to defend. Because a number can be explained. A spike can be dismissed. But a pattern, repeated over and over again, points to something deeper. Something built into the system. And this is where the investigation becomes far more serious. Because proving that an engine exceeds a limit once is complicated. But proving that it behaves the same way every lap, that changes everything. That suggests predictability, control, and most importantly, intent. And that's the word nobody wants to use yet. Because once intent enters the conversation, penalties become much more likely, much more severe. But here's where the situation becomes even more tense. Because Mercedes is not showing any signs of concern. No sudden drop in performance. No visible changes. No hesitation. They are still dominating. Still executing perfectly. As if nothing has changed. And that confidence is exactly what's making other teams nervous. Because it suggests something very simple. Mercedes already knows what the FIA will find. And they're not worried about it. And if that's true, then we're not just watching an investigation. We're watching a countdown. A countdown to the moment where the FIA has to make a decision. With the entire championship hanging in the balance. Because once that moment arrives, there will be no middle ground. No safe option. Just one outcome. That will define whether Mercedes' dominance was brilliance, or something far more controversial. And this is where the situation becomes almost impossible to control. Because the FIA is not just facing a technical decision anymore. They are facing a chain reaction. One that could impact every team, every result, every point scored so far. Because if the investigation confirms that the engine exceeds the limit in real conditions, then the next question comes immediately. How long has this been happening? From Australia? From the very first lap of the season? Because if the answer is yes, then we're not talking about one race. We're talking about all of them. And that's where the real pressure begins. Because disqualifying one race is manageable. But questioning multiple race results, that's chaos. That's something Formula One tries to avoid at all costs. And Mercedes knows it. They understand that the FIA is not just judging legality. They are judging consequences. And that gives them leverage. Because the bigger the impact of a decision, the harder it becomes to make it. But here's where things take another turn. Because inside the paddock, some teams are no longer waiting for the FIA. They're preparing for both outcomes. If Mercedes is cleared, they will copy the concept, push it even further, exploit the same behavior. But if Mercedes is penalized, they want to be ready to challenge every result, every point, every advantage gained during those early races. And that creates a second layer of tension. Because now, this is not just Mercedes versus the FIA. It's Mercedes versus everyone. And that changes the atmosphere completely. Because when multiple teams start aligning against one, pressure builds faster, louder, more aggressive. And after Japan, that pressure is rising. But here's the detail that makes everything even more unstable. Because the FIA already made one compromise. They allowed the current engines to remain legal, temporarily. Until June. A window. A controlled period where this advantage exists. And that decision now comes back into question. Because if new evidence proves that the engine goes beyond the limit during races, then that temporary legality becomes much harder to defend. Because now it's not just a gray area. It's a known behavior. And allowing it to continue becomes a decision, not a limitation. And that's where criticism starts to grow. Because some teams are already asking, did the FIA act too late? Did they allow an advantage to shape the championship before fully understanding it? And that question is dangerous. Because it shifts the focus away from Mercedes and onto the FIA itself. And once that happens, the situation escalates even further. Because now the governing body is part of the controversy, not just the judge. And that's something Formula One tries to avoid at all costs. But right now, it's unavoidable. Because every race that passes adds more weight to the final decision. More points, more consequences, more risk. And that leads to the final phase of this entire story. Because at some point, the FIA will have to choose. Protect stability, or enforce interpretation. Protect the championship, or redefine it. And there is no perfect outcome. Only consequences. And that's why this moment feels so different. Because we are no longer watching a technical debate. We are watching a turning point. The kind that doesn't just decide a season, but reshapes how the sport defines fairness itself. And when that decision finally arrives, it won't just answer whether Mercedes was legal. It will answer something much bigger. How far can a team really go? Before Formula One decides, they've gone too far? And now, we reach the part nobody in Formula One can escape. Because this is no longer about what Mercedes did. It's about what happens next. Because once the FIA delivers its final verdict, there are only two possible realities. And both of them change the sport. If Mercedes is cleared, then everything we've seen becomes the new standard. Not questioned. Not controversial. Accepted. Because the message would be clear. If you pass the test, you're legal. No matter what happens on track. No matter how the engine behaves under real conditions. And that would open the door to something much bigger. Because every team would follow the same path. Designing engines not just to meet the rules, but to transform beyond them. Pushing thermal behavior further. Pushing tolerances further. Pushing that invisible line further than ever before. And suddenly, what looks like a loophole today becomes the foundation of tomorrow. But if the FIA goes the other way, everything explodes. Because declaring the engine illegal under race conditions doesn't just stop Mercedes. It rewrites the story. Every win becomes a question. Every result becomes unstable. Every point becomes debatable. And that's where the real damage begins. Not technical. Not mechanical. Reputational. Because Formula One depends on one thing above everything else. Trust. Trust that what we're watching is fair. And once that trust is questioned, it's very hard to rebuild. But here's the part that makes this even more intense. Because inside Mercedes, this scenario has already been considered, planned for, prepared. Because teams at this level don't wait for problems. They anticipate them. And that raises one final possibility. What if Mercedes is ready for both outcomes? If they're cleared, they continue dominating. If they're restricted, they already have the next evolution prepared. A version of the engine that complies under any condition, without losing the core of their advantage. And if that's true, then the investigation doesn't stop them. It delays everyone else. Because while rivals are waiting for answers, Mercedes is already building the next question. And that leads to the final realization. The one everything has been building toward. This was never just about an illegal engine. It was about understanding the rules, better than anyone else. Understanding how they are written, how they are tested, how they are enforced, and most importantly, where they fail. Because in Formula One, the biggest advantage is not speed. It's foresight. Seeing the problem before it exists. Solving it before anyone else even notices it. And that's exactly what Mercedes may have done. So when the FIA finally makes its decision, the outcome won't just tell us if Mercedes was right or wrong. It will tell us something much more important. Whether Formula One is still a sport defined by its rules, or a sport defined by how far you can go, before those rules catch up.